took it as far as, what is this, Wall Street Bridge right here? Good job. All right. So where are you coming from? Plattsburgh, New York. And how'd you get here? That canoe. On the canal, I had like 5 or 6 portages. They're only about maybe a couple hundred yards. But this is a substantial portage. It's about a mile. And I'm going to get on that. It looks like the Assunpink. And down by Montgomery Street or Broad Street. So, channel, man, what? Assunpink? Out to Delaware? I'm not going to New York. I just came from New York. Oh yeah, man, you're coming from New York. Where you headed? I'm headed down to Florida. And it's a long trip, but I'm about a quarter to a third of the way there. I've been at it since early July. And this is the hardest part, coming through New York Harbor, then up the Riverman and down the canal. It was difficult. What made you stop through Trenton? Just the map? Well, no, I want to get on the Delaware so I can head down to the Chesapeake Delaware Canal. Then I can take into Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is a large body of water, and I'll be exposed. Yeah. But it's not as large as the Atlantic Ocean, which is my other alternative, and the Intercoastal Waterway, and I didn't want to have anything to do with that. Yeah, man, what's your whole purpose, though? Just to travel and enjoy life. It's healthy living. Right. I've lost some weight, but more important, I've tightened up quite a bit.
Hello, hello. How is everyone? And it's summer, like overnight. Summer sends us to the water, and for Riverman Dick Conant, who you saw in the video here, it was his life. He paddled the rivers of America, covered the Mississippi, the Yellowstone, the Ohio, the Hudson, as well as innumerable smaller tributaries. These solo excursions were epic feats of planning, perseverance, and physical courage. We're here tonight with Ben McGrath, author of Riverman, a moving portrait of a complex and fascinating man who was as troubled as he was charismatic, who struggled with mental illness and self-doubt, and was ultimately able to fashion a stable life for himself. He is reminiscent of another real-life character in New Hampshire who was recently in the news, River Dave. Ben is in conversation tonight with Tim Weed. In accordance with the river, I'm enjoying a nice Von Trapp Dunkel Ale this evening from the Trapp family. Lodge, what is everyone else drinking?
I want to drink Tabasco sauce.
I intended to pour shots of Tabasco sauce, which I'll explain in a bit, but I couldn't find it in the fridge.
So for now, it's just good old water.
Yeah. Well, water seems to be the drink of choice tonight. Something to do with the river, most likely. Anyway.
All right, there it is.
So stay tuned following the presentation for announcements about 4 upcoming literary cocktail hours leading up to the festival. Ben McGrath began working at the New Yorker as a fact checker in 1999 and has been a staff writer since 2003. His feature subjects have included the Tea Party movement, a mafia trial, and various dispatches from the world of sports, Formula One and Iditarod racing, the NFL's concussion crisis, and Kobe Bryant's contemplation of retirement. His new book is Riverman, An American Odyssey. He lives in New York. Tim Weed is the author of short fiction collection, A Field Guide to Murder and Fly Fishing, and a young adult novel, Willpool's Island. Tim serves on the core faculty of the Newport MFA Creative Writing Program. He is an avid outdoorsman and he lives in Vermont. Welcome, Tim and Ben.
Thank you, Sandy. And Ben, welcome. It's really great to have you here for this literary cocktail hour. I've really enjoyed this book, which everybody, Jerry has, we posted a link to how you can buy this book. I highly recommend it. It's really, I guess I would describe it as a page-turning work of narrative nonfiction that also has a lot of really interesting themes having to do with wilderness, America, psychology, character, some of which I think we'll be touching on as we go today. And I guess the plan is I'm going to start throwing out a couple of questions to Ben, and we'll just sort of have an informal conversation. But you may know, those of you who are watching, that in the chat, it says, please use the Q&A for questions to the authors. And that would be great. As we go, undoubtedly, there'll be some questions that come up. So just type them in there, and that'll be sort of a placeholder. And at certain points during the conversation, we'll keep checking and see if we can answer, if Ben can answer some of your questions. So again, Ben, welcome and congratulations. This is a beautiful hardcover book, and really highly recommended for anyone who is interested in the outdoors, in interesting characters, in sort of Americana, who maybe has read Ben's great work at the New Yorker, and who just is looking for an interesting nonfiction narrative read. So what I would love to start with, just because I'm curious, is could you tell us, Ben, a little bit about your story beyond the bio that we just heard? I mean, how did you get started in this whole writing business, and how did you end up at the New Yorker?
So my father was actually an editor at the New Yorker when I was a kid, and I refused to read it. I didn't even read the cartoons, none of it. And then by the time I went to college, he had moved to the New York Times. But I started to get interested in writing in magazines when I was in college, and as I wrote a column for the weekly paper and that kind of thing. And then I applied for a variety of kind of grunt work jobs in magazines all over New York City. And I got a job in the fact checking department at the New Yorker, in spite of the fact that, so at the time, one of the people who interviewed people for the fact checking department at the New Yorker was this guy who'd been there for, I don't know, 25 years. And he was a kind of an Anglophile, and he would quiz people on, how many people are in the House of Representatives, and how many, who wrote the this or that piece of classical music, and then he asked me, what books I was reading in college, and I sort of just started rattling off names from my political philosophy class, and I said, Edmund Burke and John Stuart Mill, whatever, and he said, oh, Burke, what did you read by Burke? And I said, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which wasn't really true, because although it was on the syllabus, I had skipped it. And he was like, oh, what did you think of that? And I was like, oh, to be honest, it wasn't my favorite, because I had nothing to say about it. And there was a long pause. And he said, well, that is unfortunate, because Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France is the greatest book ever written. And then he went into a crazy coughing fit. He smoked like way too many cigarettes. And then the interview ended shortly thereafter, because he was not healthy. But anyway, I got the job somehow.
Wow. Okay, that's great. What a good story. So that's also a really good answer to the questions. It's not my favorite. I haven't read it. It's not my favorite. Well done. So anyway, so you're a New Yorker writer, and that's a very specific kind of, for me anyway, a very specific kind of long form journalism. I'm an avid New Yorker reader. I don't read everything, but I try to read as much as I can. But it seems to me that the typical New Yorker story is sort of a braided story, where you get information that's alternating with a personal story. The story of that's the typical setup is kind of this. So could you talk a little bit about that form of nonfiction, and how you adapt? I'm curious about how you had to adapt the technique of writing an article to writing the book. I mean, we were talking about this earlier a little bit, your history of writing profiles of sports figures and athletes, and the amount of material that you had to work with this story. But what is different about writing a book length narrative nonfiction as opposed to magazine articles?
Right. So I think the New Yorker, the kind of conventional New Yorker profile or long feature piece, it kind of aspires to a level of omniscience, like sort of so that when you're shifting gears, as you say, in this sort of braided element, when you're sort of observing the character in action, and then you're sort of closing a section off, and then you're starting kind of clearing your throat, and then telling how you came to the story, and then clearing your throat again, and then going back. You're trying to make the reader feel like you've been so inside this subject through deep reporting and observation that everything that's worth knowing can be distilled into these 5,000 words or 8,000 words. And that's kind of a challenging art, because a lot of the time, especially if you're writing about a prominent person, and like say a professional athlete, what you're actually getting access to is pretty little. You know, you're contending with publicists and gatekeepers all along, and sort of fairly staged moments. Some of the best and most famous New Yorker profiles, like, you know, Lillian Ross with Hemingway or something, are cases where the subject really just didn't care and let the writer hang out for days at a time, so that the things that you choose to put in those 8,000 words are really the best and most representative moments. The reality more often is that you're kind of doing a bit of smoke and mirrors and trying to sort of compose a pastiche that's entertaining and seems to have been chosen from a lot. So a book really requires much more access of the kind of Lillian Ross with Hemingway variety. And in the case of this subject, I really did have that kind of access to the character. It definitely brought its own challenges for me, which is that almost having too much, you know, when you have a little bit to work with and you've got to kind of blow it up into 8,000 words, the structure kind of sometimes presents itself fairly obviously. Whereas when you have an infinite amount to work with and you've got 250 pages or something, you can go back to the drawing board day after day and just say, no, that's not right. I'll start here. No, that's not right. I'll start here. I found it challenging.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Too long.
Too long. You know, as a novelist myself, I'll tell you that's generally the right answer. But
yeah, I mean, you know, the better part of 5 or 6 years, I was doing some other stuff in between, and COVID happened, and we were homeschooling our kids because they couldn't go to school. But the writing process was probably a good 5 years. Yeah.
Well, as I was sort of mentioning, I think the book packs in a lot of thematic information. You know, a lot of information about Dick Conant. Is it Conant or Conant? Conant. Yeah. So Dick as a character, and you know, and his story, which I want to talk about in a minute, it really seems like a very sort of quintessentially American story. So it's really interesting. But so there's that, and then there's, you know, the way that you weave in, you know, your personal interactions with him and with his family and stuff like that. And so anyway, and with these bigger themes that I want to talk about in a minute, but I want to start out with it. So there's a really striking metaphor near the beginning of the book about a fish that you found in a basement in Brooklyn. Yeah. And this was something that you took as a sign that it was time to move out of the city, you know, to move up to the Hudson River Valley, which is, I guess, where you still live. So, but then this metaphor gets extended because it turns out that this fish is a koi, right? Or at least that's how I read it. The fish is a koi, so a domestic fish that actually, because you were sort of like, okay, a fish is in my basement. There's a big, you know, was it Hurricane Sandy or something like that?
That's
There's
right. It was Hurricane Sandy. It floods the whole basement level, flooded within inches of the ceiling, and then cleaning up afterwards, there's a fish in the basement, and it's like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
Fish, you know.
Yeah. Really, it's just really a striking metaphor. But what's interesting to me is that it's sort of like, it's not a wild fish that's been washed in from the vast wilderness ocean. Right. It's a koi from a neighbor's fish pond. So it's this metaphor for me of the domestic versus the wilderness, the settled versus the wild. And this seems to be the metaphor in a way that sort of triggers the story of Dick Conant's canoe journeys and ultimately the process of writing the book for you. So could you comment on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, I mean, we were living in a neighborhood of Brooklyn that's quite near the water, and that was what attracted me to the neighborhood. It felt kind of like a seafaring town in the city. And when Hurricane Sandy came, it was devastating. We had a young child, and our house was ruined. Luckily, we were only renting, and we were able to walk away from it. But there was something kind of powerful in my mind at first about the idea of like, oh wow, okay, well, you know, you read about climate change and all the apocalypse that's coming for us that we've brought upon ourselves, and I did kind of think at first like, well, it's kind of cool that, you know, it's like, you know, what if a shark swims into my house? Like, then this is what's the storm brought me, a wild beast, and then I realized that it was just from literally next door. The neighbors had a koi pond, so it was like the equivalent of somebody's goldfish just returning to your house, and it wasn't as wild as I thought. When we moved up to where we are now in the Hudson Valley, the kind of the fish that replaced the koi in my mind is the sturgeon, which is a fish that's been around since the dinosaurs, and it's an endangered fish here in the Hudson River, but you still see them when I go out on the river. You know, they leap out of the water and they're there, and that felt a lot more truly wild to me. And when Dick Conant came down the river, he seemed a little bit more like a sturgeon than like a koi to me, in large part because he didn't come with any like pre-packaging. Like, you know, there was no press release that said, get a load of this guy, he's coming down the Hudson River. He just showed up, and I couldn't find anything, basically almost nothing about it on the internet. It was just like, it really was kind of like a monster fish that you just hooked in the river.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a great sort of way to sort of think about starting the book. I love that metaphor. Just reminding everyone that you do have the Q&A function. If you want to type in a question, I promise we will get to as many of those as we can before we go. But I want to sort of continue on this theme for a moment, Ben, because it strikes me that, you know, so Ben Conant he goes on these endless canoe journeys, and you point out, I think very, very well in a couple of different places in the book, how it's really part of a sort of quintessentially American tradition. You know, you use the example of Lewis and Clark setting off up the Missouri River, or Huckleberry Finn setting off on the Mississippi, or Forrest Gump, you know, running across the country, or Christopher McCandless from the famous Into Thin Air book, setting off alone into the Alaskan wilderness, or even Neil Armstrong touching down on the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. So something about leaving civilization behind. I mean, this is where the koi metaphor comes in. It's sort of like, okay, we're leaving the domestic behind, and we're setting off into a place that is at least metaphorically beyond the frontier. And I think this is a really compelling insight into, at least for me, you know, what sort of motivated Dick Conant in a way, and helps us understand the story you're trying to tell. But for the benefit of everyone here listening, can you preview that a bit for us? What's so American about embarking on a journey like this?
Well, so part of it is, you know, America is it's a young country compared to, you know, the countries from which we came, and it's vast, right? Europe, which is, you know, Europe is basically the size of America, but it's carved up into individual countries. And so if you take all of Europe and make it one big thing, all of a sudden you have this opportunity to light after the territory, to use the Twain phrase, to keep pushing the frontier and explore outward. And that's sort of been part of the American founding, you know, kind of mythology ever since we arrived. And people, you know, obviously there were indigenous people here, and there's lots of things that complicate this story, right? But the Europeans come, they arrive on the East Coast of the United States, and then as they get frustrated or curious, they start pushing west and keep exploring until eventually they make it all the way and run out of room. So that's been kind of part of our mythology ever since. And you have these people throughout, you know, both folk heroes in our own lore, kind of, you know, Johnny Appleseed type characters who go sort of traipsing across the countryside and conquering, kind of pioneering settlers. And that tradition, Dick Conant was a well-read man. He was sort of steeped in that tradition, and he'd grown up in a military family. He definitely had a patriotic sense of himself, and that he definitely felt that he was participating in this American tradition of sort of lighting after the territory, pushing out. When it doesn't work here, you can just keep going and find something else. There aren't those national, but you don't have to keep showing your passport to get somewhere in the United States. You can, for now at least.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that these journeys that we hear about, you know, the ones that, you know, lighting out for the territories that we hear about are successful journeys. But I mean, how many journeys do people undertake that are ultimately not successful, and, you know, that ultimately fail or end in tragedy, you know? And so to me, that's another thing that's interesting about this story is he's not a famous, I mean, maybe he'll be famous after this book, but he wasn't, you know, he was kind of laboring in obscurity. And, you know, whereas Lewis and Clark, of course, you know, have gone down in the annals, as has Neil Armstrong and everyone else. So That's an interesting thought. I mean, what about, is this, in a way, is this something that many Americans do, or that many people do, and that we only hear about the successful ones,
Well, so I have two things to say about that. One is, so in the case of Lewis and Clark, Meriwether Lewis actually committed suicide within 3 years of returning from that
Yes.
mission,
Yeah.
and is now, I believe, thought to have been bipolar. There's one thing which we could discuss or not later, which is that though this is part of our mythology, it's not generally the pastime of the well-adjusted, right? I mean, there's a reason why people pick up and go somewhere. And another, you mentioned other people who are not successful, and Chris McCandless in Into the Wild is another case of someone who, he's famous now because he died young, and the power in that story to me is partly from the lives he touched on the way. He, like Dick Conant, was a charismatic person who seemed to have meant a lot to the people he met who were worried about him, but also because his life ended abruptly, and part of, as a reader or a watcher of the movie, you're kind of imagining, well, what could have happened if only. And Dick Conant is kind of an interesting contrast in my mind in that sense, because he survived a whole bunch of times until he disappeared. So he was 40 years older than Chris McCandless was, but he had been, it's like he did it, he felt better, then he got back to normal life. It wasn't working so much again. He went out again on the river. He felt better. He went back. Each time there was a kind of a hope that, well, I'll be happier, and then I'll come back and I'll be well adjusted, and now maybe I'll get a job at a hospital and everything will be good. And the reality, I think, for most people who end up doing these things is that those problems that they have with conventional life are likely to recur, and the wilderness or the sort of the frontier bound exploration is a kind of a coping mechanism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the fact that, most of these other journeys, were a one-time thing. I mean, Christopher McCandless was just, it was a one-time thing, whereas in Dick's case, it was repeated, and he did it. He was successful several times,
right,
before he ended up disappearing.
So the other thing, I'm sorry to interrupt, but to your question before, when you mentioned how how common is this, one of the things I discovered through the reporting of this book, basically using the name Dick Conant as a password, is that actually this kind of wanderlust is everywhere amongst us. I mean, for the way I met Dick Conant was he was at my neighbor's house right down the hill. I'm looking out, the Hudson River's right there, and my neighbor's house is right on the water. And as of the time I met Dick Conant, I didn't really know much about my neighbor, other than that he was a personable kind of guy who said, happy day a lot. And we're in his house, and there's Dick Conant at the head of his table, and then one of his friends slips upstairs and brings down a framed newspaper clipping, and it turns out my neighbor in 1977 or 78 or something rode his bike from New York to Florida. And this kind of thing happened over and over again. I would call someone who, there was I won't give you too many other examples because I could go on endlessly about this, but I while combing through some of the artifacts that I came upon, I found a note that a radio host left in Dick Conant's boat in 1999 when he was going down the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. And the note said, if you're going down the river, please call me. I host a radio show about the outdoors. So I call that guy, whatever, more than 15 years later, and say, I found this note. By the way, did you ever interview a man named Dick Conant? And he said, no, I don't think I did, but it's funny you mention it, because the son of my best friend is canoeing the Mississippi River as we speak. That kind of thing just kept on turning up wherever I went. Someone was doing something, just sort of was just, people were sort of seekers everywhere, was the phrase I used. I mean, people were just wandering at any given moment. People are crisscrossing this continent in interesting ways.
No,
for no particular reason.
I have a friend from college who I graduated from college from, who for like 3 or 4 years in a row, he's a ski coach in Colorado, and he rode his bike from Aspen down the Pan American Highway all the way to Tierra del Fuego, or to where he was teaching skiing down in Chile and back. It's crazy. Yeah, so I know that you have a little PowerPoint. You can give us some visuals, which would be really great. But before we do that, though, I wanted to just ask. I just had one more question. Then hopefully people will, as they watch the PowerPoint and stuff, like, oh, good, we have some more questions from the audience as well. Well, let me actually get to this one from the audience before we go in, just to make sure. This is from Mary Layton. It says, hello, Ben. Hello, Tim. This is Mary Layton, Dickie's sister. I thank you, Ben, for all your hard work and research. The book was difficult for me to get through, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to see my brother in a completely different way. I take comfort in believing that his life was more than mental illness and pain. He figured out a way to find peace. Thank you for that. Wow, that's a really amazing comment.
Well, yeah, thank you, Mary. So for everyone's benefit, I should say, I've now met many of Dick Conant's siblings, and they've just been, every single one of them has been really wonderful and all interesting in their own way. And they're just all, I think they've all they're just all extremely engaging people, easy to talk to and kind of full of life. So anyway, thank you, Mary. I'm sorry it was difficult for you to get through, but I hope it means something for you.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful comment. Thank you for chiming in, Mary. Well, I guess this brings up, a difficult question that I had, which was having to do with, not really a question, but one of the themes that keeps coming up in the book for me is the cycle. So when you mentioned this a little earlier too, is that you don't set off on these journeys necessarily because you're happy where you are, right? So the psychological difficulties of being alone in a situation like this for months on end, absolutely alone. You give these very compelling examples of round the world sailors, seeing ghosts, hallucinating, losing their minds. And so I thought this was a really interesting theme, and maybe you could comment a little bit about how this sort of played into your perceptions of what happened to what Dick was up to.
So yeah, one of the things actually that I learned from a couple of his brothers early on was that Dick had he struggled with paranoia. The way one of them, I guess the phrase that I kind of liked, because it was on theme here, that I guess he himself used with their mother, was he said he had mental barnacles. But he had a hard time. He feared overstaying his welcome, and so this is, I think, something that people who are on the move often, to varying degrees, struggle with, which is he was a very talented man, right? He'd been a brilliant student and a great athlete. He had a ton of promise and therefore a lot of expectation. And when it wasn't working out for him, like many people, he tended to blame his surroundings and feel like he could improve things by moving. So in that sense, getting on a boat was a kind of an ingenious solution to a problem, because all of a sudden he was sort of traveling at the pace of current, which allowed him to sort of arrive in places as an unknown quantity, like a sort of a high plains drifter or something, and as a kind of a celebrity in many of these towns. Because he came in, he was without any fanfare, and it was just so mysterious that he was treated really, really well. And then time would go on, and he'd have to move. The other thing, though, as mentioned, is when you're on a boat, you are stuck with your own thoughts for a lot of the time. And so if you have a tendency to struggle with certain illnesses, it can be a challenging environment where you're in a town, all of a sudden you think it's going south, you got to get going, and then for the next couple of days it's just you and a boat, and you're paddling. And so as you say, yes, a lot of sailors tend to hallucinate and hear voices and go a little bit cabin fever, as the phrase exists for a reason. He had some kind of techniques he would use to try and kind of ward off too much of that thought. He would count cycles of paddles. So every four paddle strokes he called a cycle, and he would count them, into the thousands while he was going, as a way of preventing his mind from getting occupied with more dangerous things. And he would kind of create storylines in those cycles. What was kind of cool was he would he would think of the cycle, the amassing cycle counts as like a historical timeline. So he was sort of going from the birth of Jesus to, you know, World War II, and then his own birth, and then he would start sort of flashing almost through a slideshow or a movie script of his own life as he's, you know, here I am now in 1957, and we're in Fort Knox, and, you know, and here I am in, you know, 1958, and we've moved to Pearl River, and it was a kind of an interesting technique and a way of avoiding some of the inevitability of nautical mania.
It's fascinating, that technique. I have another comment here. This is actually in the chat from, hi Ben, I am Chris Kelly's sister. I live in Vermont and work in Brattleboro. Grew up with the Conants. Great read.
So the Kelly family is another great family I've gotten to know through this. And actually Chris Kelly, whose sister wrote here, Chris Kelly is the person who connected me with the Conant family to begin with. After Dick Conant disappeared, which happened about 3 months after I first met him here in my town, the Hudson River, Chris Kelly reached out to me. I hadn't met him at this point, on behalf of a couple of Dick's brothers, and said that they were interested in meeting me, and he sort of facilitated that. And it turned out the Kellys and the Conants had grown up next door to one another here in Rockland County, New York, and had a kind of amazing, kind of sort of Mark Twainish boyhood, just sort of running through the woods and exploring, you know, rivers and dinghies and stuff. And and so Chris Kelly still carries a card in his wallet. In fact, I saw him just last week or the week before, and he still has it. It says it's the Catfish Yacht Club, and it's a card that Dick Conant had printed up when they were in, I think, middle school, and that was the name they gave themselves as kind of wannabe explorers in what was then kind of ex-urban New York, trending suburban. And they gave themselves titles, you know, Commodore Kelly, and, you know, First Mate Pete, and Deck Swabber Diane, and but it resonated. I mean, this is long before Dick Conant became a figure of interest to me and the subject of a book. That card and that club still meant so much to Chris Kelly that he carries it in his wallet ever since, and it's been 50 years, more than. So
it's amazing, and we have a Brattleboro connection as well. Chris Kelly's sister lives in Vermont and works in Brattleboro, so that's wonderful. Well, I wonder if you feel like showing us some visuals. I'd love to.
Yeah, sure. Let me get going on that. All right. I got to get off this slide. Hold on. It's not working. One sec. Let me try this again. Okay. All right. Sorry about this.
No, yes, no.
Get this going. All right. Let's try again.
There we go.
Presenter view, right?
Yeah.
There we go. All right, so this is Dick Conant on the Hudson River. The day after I first met him at my neighbor's house, I tracked him down about a dozen miles south of us, and this is a picture that he took. So one of the things that happened, he disappeared, as I say, about 3 months later. His boat was found upside down in North Carolina, and the memory card to his digital camera was among the things that were still salvageable. It was in a Ziploc bag, and after it dried out. And so these are pictures that he took for the most part. This is where he came ashore to meet me on a beach here. And then he starts showing me the stuff in his canoe, the key detail of which is here on the left, that you see that Mount Olive jar of hot dogs in pickle juice.
Yeah.
That was his staple. I had wondered when I first met him, again, you talked about this sort of this tension between domestic and wild, and I kind of thought when I first met him, like, oh wow, maybe he's constantly catching fish and frying them up, and that's how he's living. But no, what he for the most part, what he was doing, is at least as a backup plan, was he would get to a river town like the one I live in or somewhere, and he would go in and he would buy hot dogs or smoked sausages and stick them in pickle juice to preserve them. The brine was salty enough that it would preserve them, and that he always had a protein source on hand as a result of that.
That's really cool. It's also a great tip for, for a travel tip for
exactly for future adventurers. You could do worse than. And we alluded at the beginning in that survey for people, what cocktail you're drinking, and we included Tabasco sauce. The reason for that is that when I was on the beach interviewing him, he started pouring himself sort of little shot capfuls of Tabasco and shooting them, and he was sort of sipping soy sauce straight from the bottle, which he said was energizing the flavor buds, which I thought was a kind of a cool way. Again, sort of the tips that you come to through trial and error for how to entertain yourself and find pleasures in unexpected places. This is an example of the notes he would keep on. He navigated with road atlases, even though he was traveling always by water, and he would sort of write down everything everywhere, including on the insides of paperback books he was reading. This is just in the inside covers, wherever there was a place to write something, he would write down notes, and just kind of everything that happened to him he would write down. It was which was a gift to me as a writer trying to recreate his life, because he just amassed facts about his own life. So then he told me about the 5 different trips that he'd taken. This first one up in the upper left corner where I wrote number 1 was on the Salmon River in Idaho. He intended to make it to the Pacific Ocean using this homemade boat. That's him in 1994. What happened is that bow that you can see, the front 15 inches of it fell off after he tumbled into a rock, and he couldn't go any farther. He only made it 350 miles that trip, but it was kind of a learning experience, he called it. It was a proof of concept. He learned that he could find happiness amid unhappiness by getting out on rivers. So we tried again 5 years later, and he did this trip that I've marked in yellow. That's number 2. That was on the Yellowstone, the Missouri, and the Mississippi rivers. And here he is on those, those rivers. Then here we have number 3, where he starts in western New York on the Allegheny River and goes all the way down to Texas in that blue line. And here you have him. Here he picked up a rack of deer antlers and threw it on the bow to make himself feel a little bit more primal. And but here you can see he's going from some really scenic rivers to some more sort of industrial waterways here. There he is in Texas. Then number 4 was kind of the most epic one, as he called it, where he goes down the whole length of the Mississippi, and then he gets down to the Gulf and goes over, and then starts going upstream on the Mobile River, the Tombigbee River, the Tennessee River, the Holston River, and then he hitches a ride with a guy he'd met, a very generous Good Samaritan he'd met in Alabama. He hitches a ride over the mountains and onto the James River in Virginia and takes him all the way out towards the Atlantic Ocean. There he is in Alabama on the Tombigbee River in that trip. This is 2010. That trip spanned the better part of 2 years. As you can see, he packs those boats pretty full. He doesn't have a lot of freeboard. Though one of the things he explained to me was that packing the boats full, obviously partly it was because he was traveling with all that he needed, and he collected things, and it was a bit of a pack rat. But also it had its advantages. He learned from sort of tugboat captains down south that they often would use more fuel pushing empty barges than full barges, because with an empty barge, it's sort of more susceptible to wind and currents, and they had to spend a lot more time corralling them, and that a heavier boat would be it's sort of the slow and steady wins the race phenomenon. It's sort of it's not going to get pushed around. And then the last one is the green line down the eastern seaboard, which is where I met him, and where he this is the article I wrote after my first encounter with him. Yeah. But then 3 months later, as I say, he only made it as far as North Carolina, and this is the boat with the park ranger as they brought it in. You can see all this stuff that was inside the boat was still salvageable, and Dick's brother Joe, one of many, went and collected all this stuff and brought most of it back to his house in Georgia and dried it out, and did a really careful job preserving this stuff, so that when I eventually took a look at it, it was pretty easy to go through. One of the things that another one of his brothers showed me was this was an example of one of the so-called books that he'd written. He told me he'd written 3 that he wasn't published yet. So when he would finish these, you saw those notes earlier on his road atlases, he would convert those into typed prose when he finished his trips. And in fact, when I met him, he had a laptop in one of his bags buried in the canoe, and which he wasn't planning to turn on until he got to Florida. And then he was going to write a book about it. And you know, these books got longer and longer the more he went. This one here in 2000, I think, was only about 130 pages. The next one was like 500 pages, and the third one was like 1,000 or 1,100 pages. And he got more expansive as he got more interested in some of the people he met. One of the other things that we found through the effects left behind was he had these storage lockers in Utah and Montana where he'd been preserving these paintings that he'd been done. He'd been a great artist. He was an art major in college, and this painting in particular I liked because it looks to me like a self-portrait of him at around the time that he reinvented himself as a riverman. So he's standing inside a cracked egg, which kind of, you know, again, if we're talking in terms of metaphors, hints at a rebirth. And it shows his love of the outdoors. Obviously, his paintings tended to focus on geography, and they're pretty incredible. The range is really wide, all kinds of styles. And then here I started with his digital camera, sort of, you know, following, sort of like, well, okay, what happened to him after he left here up in the Hudson Valley? And here we have him paddling by the Statue of Liberty. One of the things I liked about his photography style was he always kind of framed the picture with his bow in one of the corners, so you can kind of, it felt kind of like an early explorer's like film, like Nanook of the North or something.
Yeah.
So then he gets onto the Arthur Kill. Now he's inside Staten Island. He's kind of going between Staten Island and New Jersey, and I kind of like the fact that here he's in this tiny canoe. This canoe, by the way, he bought for like $300 at Dick's Sporting Goods. He wasn't a guy who had like a real special boat. He was frugal, and he just bought what he could afford, launched it up near the Canadian border, and made it all the way to Staten Island, where he's contending with these container ships that are, you know, 100 feet high. Then he gets onto the Raritan River in New Jersey, and he starts going inland. And from there, he gets onto the Delaware and Raritan Canal. This is also a great image because you see his Tabasco there and his soy sauce. Those are some of his on-the-go refreshments. And from there, he starts sliding under. This is Route 1 in New Jersey for anyone who's ever driven this. The canal is going underneath the highway, so he's got to slide under. If you think this one's low, wait till you check out this one. So here, he's got to be lying back all the way and sliding under. And then the next one that's coming up is a great one because he wrote about it in his notes, and then I saw the picture that proved it. He wrote about how the map in his mind, he would study these routes on like Google Earth and with satellite views, and kind of plot his routes in advance. And he was expecting the canal to do something different from what it did, and it ran into a kind of a barrier that he wasn't anticipating. And so he looked at his options and decided that he would go down this culvert pipe to get onto a different body of water. So he went and he wrote in his notes that he was canoeing like a ski jumper. This is actually down a grade. So he was sliding downhill through a pipe, at the end of which he got air and then landed in this creek.
That's crazy.
Which now we're getting, you know, this is a little less scenic, right? He's approaching Trenton, so we're kind of in grimy industrial New Jersey. And that's where, for those who were here at the beginning when we watched a video, that was him taking a break while dragging his canoe across land in urban Trenton. Eventually, he decided to cross the Delaware on a bridge instead of under the water. I don't really quite know why he did that, but Washington crossed the Delaware on water, and Dick did it on a bridge. Then he gets on the Delaware. Here he is. From there, he gets he ran into some trouble with the tides while he was doing grocery shopping and all his stuff. This is where his laptop got swamped, and he was going to have to get a new laptop if he was going to write that book in Florida. And then he's peaceful again on the Chesapeake Delaware Canal. Here again, he's resting on a beach, and you see these giant container ships or tankers going by. And then he gets to Chesapeake Bay, and I couldn't figure out what had happened. I saw these strange notes on his maps about the Ra, and eventually I figured out that he hooked up with this guy on the left, who was driving a solar-powered boat and trying to break a Guinness World Record for the most miles traveled only under solar power. And the Chesapeake Bay was a kind of choppy body of water, so Dick put his canoe on the solar boat, and they tried to get across. And then the solar boat started running into some trouble, and the two of them started not getting along. We talked earlier about the challenges of traveling alone on water and what that can do to your mind, but the challenges of living on a boat with another stranger in tight quarters may be even greater than the challenges with yourself. So when they made it to a marina where Dick came off the boat screaming, this guy's going to kill me, get me away from him. He ended up making it down to something called the Dismal Swamp Canal, which was a kind of a fitting name for what was about to happen to him, I guess. But the Dismal Swamp Canal goes through an area with the most bears per square mile of anywhere in the United States. Oh. And he emerges onto the Pasquotank River here in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And then from there out into Albemarle Sound, which is huge. It's inside of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's about 50 miles wide and I don't know, 10 miles north to south. So this is, I took this picture from a boat as we entered Albemarle Sound. This is looking due south as from the mouth of the Pasquotank as it empties out into the Sound. Where Dick's canoe was ultimately found was up against these cypress stumps, kind of hung up upside down on these cypress stumps on the northern shore of Albemarle Sound. And this here is the last photograph that was taken of him, and it was I want to say November 15th, so 3.5 months after I met him in a bookstore in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. The bookstore owner took this picture of him. She was charmed by him, as most people were on his travels. And the last known sighting of him was the next day. Some kayakers saw him traveling on the Pasquotank out towards Albemarle Sound, and he has not been seen since, nor has his body been found. But this is the last image that we have.
Really cool. Really, really interesting to see those visuals after having read the book. Couple of things that sort of stand out to me is really interesting, because earlier we were talking about, this idea of the domestic versus wilderness, and how, maybe this redefines our concept of what wilderness is, because so many of those photos are of container ships and, industrial landscapes, and, the ability to sort of find beauty and inspiration or challenge in that is really interesting. His conception of what this river trip, because it was a wild experience, and yet it was through this sort of industrial heartland.
Yeah. So one of the things that it took me a while to figure this out while reading through. He wrote voluminously, and so hundreds, thousands of pages. But one of the things I figured out while sort of charting the way that his writing changed over the years, and also the way his trip itineraries changed, is that when he began, he really did seek out the most wild rivers possible with the fewest people. And he even wrote in one of his early journal entries that humans are an unpredictable pathogen. He was really trying to get away from people. Over time, what he found was that actually he craved social life that people offered, and what he just wanted was a way to have a social life that, I'm projecting here, but like he remembered as a child. He was an extremely popular kid, right? He wasn't an outcast. He was voted picture perfect in the high school yearbook. And so actually what he found was that these river trips were kind of an interesting balance of, days alone in beautiful scenery, kind of where his time was his own. It was all up to him. And then these really festive sort of period stays, 3 days here, a week there, 36 hours here, 2 weeks there, in these river towns where he would befriend people, and he made tons of friends. And that was the kind of, the longer he went on this, the more I think that the the writing became really about other people and less about himself. And it was, what the insight for me was, and which I think maybe we can all benefit from this, is he was sort of turning the lens away, it's sort of not navel-gazing, it's sort of not sort of going, we have this image, again, to stick with the American metaphor, right, of sort of Thoreau going to Walden Pond and staring at the water and looking into his own reflection and kind of trying to see the depths of himself. And Dick Conant used to say, like, I'm not lost. I'm not looking for myself. I'm looking for geography and I'm looking for other people. And so the river, unlike the pond, is this place of connection. A pond is a kind of a closed environment, right? A pond can only be ruined by the arrival of something that doesn't belong there. If you're Thoreau at your pond and someone else shows up, well, then your peace has been disturbed. On a river, it's never the same thing, right? What's the line from Heraclitus? You can never step in the same river twice, right? It's always changing, so it can't be spoiled by anything, a new, and in fact, anything new that comes down is a sort of a source of inspiration, and so I think that was kind of, for me, what was interesting about how he changed in my mind the kind of the archetype of the American wilderness explorer in the sense of like, well, the rivers are these natural environments that connect social environments, and that was essential for him. I think he was really trying to have a social life that he wasn't able to have if he stayed put.
That's really interesting. The other thing that was striking from that was that I didn't realize this before, but that there's so much time, that these journeys took place over such an extended period of time that, I have to kind of admire this sort of persistence of this, call it an obsession or interest or whatever. He did this over many, many years. So that's an interesting thing. It was kind of a long-term commitment that he had, or how would you see that? It sounds like he would go on a voyage and then he would try to settle back into life, and then that would not be successful and he'd start off again, or?
Yeah, so that's right. So when he began, hold on, one of my children, can you please, I'm busy. Sorry, I have a child trying to break into my office.
Life on Zoom.
When he began, I think like a lot of people who go on trips like this, or maybe not so many people go on trips like this, but when a lot of people go on voyages of self-exploration or whatever, I think he hoped that he was solving a problem right then and there, right? There was a kind of like, I'm going to fix this. I'm not happy. I'm going to go do this thing, and then all will be better. We all do this in our own daily lives, right? Like I play, beer league ice hockey, right? I go, and then sort of a stressful day kind of falls away through the exertion and the endorphins, and then all of a sudden I wake and I sleep better, and I wake up. That was sort of his idea initially. What happened after the first couple of trips is the pattern would recur, right? And so as I studied his writing over time, I think he gradually became aware of himself, not as at first he was someone who wanted to be a doctor. He tried to get into medical school a couple of times, and so he was sort of like all right, but if I can't be a doctor, maybe I'll go on this river trip, and then when I finish that, I'll try again, and I'll see if I can become a doctor. And then by third, fourth trip, he has started to reconceive himself as what he started calling people as a canoeist who writes books. And of course, he did work jobs in the meantime. He earned money. They were, he worked in hospitals as a kind of a nurse, or he worked most recently in Montana, he'd been working as a bus ticket salesman. But over time, what happened is the frame shifts, and all of a sudden he's not a wannabe doctor who goes on river trips. He's a river explorer who works at a bus station. Yeah. And those jobs in between become the period where he's preparing for another trip, and he sort of knows in his mind, okay, here I am, I've just finished a trip, I'm going to have to settle down and work for a couple of years and get my bearings again, but then I'm working towards another trip, and that will be something to look forward to. It's like I'm not looking forward to like finally getting rich by being a doctor, because that wasn't going to happen, but he was going to get rich on the river through discovery.
Cool. So now we have a couple of questions coming up. One is from Jerry, who says, if you get it, were there any forensic investigations into his disappearance, about weather, storms, some other speculation about what might have happened?
So the challenge with his disappearance, because I was initially frustrated when I went down to North Carolina and met the investigators, who were very nice as well. But I was sort of like, how can there not be better clues? The challenge is that he wasn't reporting to anyone, right? Like, his sister was on here earlier and mentioned he was not in touch with her. I think it had been 20 years or something since he'd seen her last, or maybe 10. He was only sporadically in touch with his family, and he even told me when I was interviewing him that he kind of made a point of not getting in touch with his family until he was nearing the end of his trips, because he didn't want them to worry. I think on some level he didn't want to be tracked down. He wanted to be doing things on his own terms. Because of that, because he wasn't reporting to anyone, he had no last known location. So the investigators, I now have been able to piece as much as I can together of his journey, but they found an upside down canoe. I got a phone call. In fact, the guy who called me told me at the time he was hoping that I was going to say, yes, you found my canoe. Thank you. I'll come get it. My phone number was written on a piece of paper because I'd written it for Dick's benefit so we could remain in touch. They just found an upside down canoe full of stuff and were like, what? And they had no knowledge at that time of when's the last time he was supposed to be anywhere. He wasn't reporting to anyone. So they didn't have an accident site, right? Because a body of water, if you find a car in the woods, that it crashed there. Like, that's where it crashed. You find a boat on the water, it's possible that it was floating for 2 weeks and it landed somewhere else. So they were kind of playing from behind. They flew planes and helicopters for a couple of days over Albemarle Sound, but they were kind of going north and south. As we subsequently discovered, he wouldn't have been going directly across. He would have been hugging the shore. So it was wasted effort. But it's hard to fault them for it. They were dealing with a really unknown quantity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have one more question. This probably will be the last question. This is from Brian Mooney. First of all, Brian says, thanks for the great talk. He says, Ben, I'm curious what connects you to the material besides the attraction to Dick and the intrinsic interest of his story. I mean, more like what his story satisfies inside of you. Can you say a little bit about that deep draw that resonates big time with you?
So I guess there are two things. One is I grew up in suburban New Jersey. It was a perfectly pleasant upbringing. I had no problem with it, but it was sort of the opposite of open river country, right? It's pretty circumscribed. And there were some woods behind our house, and I used to like many kids, I think, I used to sort of like fantasizing that I was disappearing into the woods, sort of away from the cul-de-sacs of that we all know. And when Dick Conant came by, I had my 2.5-year-old son with me at the time, and I kind of liked the idea that this was like a bedtime story. We had shortly moved here to the river, and I thought, well, this is cool. Like I can have my son will know that the river is this place for the imagination, right? You never know what's going to come down this river. Like, the river is big, and it speaks of untold stories. And here's an example. Santa Claus just arrived in a canoe. This is great. And when I was talking to Dick, he mentioned something about how the next place he was going to get to that was going to be really remote was central New Jersey. And I was like, how can and he told me at this point he lived in Montana. How can a guy who lives in Montana and paddles down rivers, like, how can that guy think of central New Jersey as remote? And it was like, it was a kind of fascinating lesson in kind of like, it's all kind of the way you conceive it. Like, you can make anywhere remote if you like, find a vessel and put yourself, set yourself afloat, and you can go down some of those gritty looking creeks that I showed you on the PowerPoint, and you can feel like you're kind of an adventurer, on a continent conquering mission, which indeed he was. And the second element of it is that I could sense by the second day that I was talking to him that there was something not quite right with his life. And there was something poignant about it. I think like a lot of people, there was a part of me that wanted, I was a relatively new father at that point. There was something, he was much older than I was, but I felt a little bit paternal about him, I felt worried on his behalf, but also kind of amazed at how warmly he spoke of all the people he met. There was something really moving to me about how a guy whose life had clearly been very difficult could have such fond impressions of so many people everywhere, and also it was kind of inspirational that people were, you get a lot of bad thoughts about the world and the country these days, and like people were responding very favorably to this guy over and over again, and there was something kind of amazing about that, and I just sort of wanted to bask in it. I wanted to sort of borrow some of that positive energy.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation, Ben. I know that Sandy wants to jump back in and say a few words, but before we do that, also thank you for this really wonderful book, and I hope everybody will click on the link to buy this book, to support this author, and to also get a good read for yourself about a really important and interesting and just entertaining topic. So, Ben, it's been an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben and Tim. That was an amazing presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We have 4 exciting literary cocktail hour events leading up to the festival. On Friday, June 10th, we will host Grant Faulkner, who's the founder and director of NaNoWriMo, the literary group out of California that challenges us to write a novel in a month every November, and he has a book of his own. Friday, July 8th, will feature critically acclaimed author Sarah Manguso, who's the author of Very Cold People. Friday, August 12th, will feature Colleen Kinder, editor of Letter to a Stranger, and there will be authors from that book also with her. And Friday, September 9th, will feature Maud Newton, the author of Ancestor Trouble, which has been getting a lot of attention in the world of ancestry. So very exciting, and we'll be sending out notices, and everybody have a great weekend and enjoy.
Thanks, Ben. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.